All right. Good morning, East Side SDA Fellowship. I'm John Griffin, and this is Jody, and I'm here with my dad, John Griffin, in Boring, Oregon, and my brother-in-law, Lee Meadowcroft, in Boring, Oregon. And it is Saturday, January 13, 2024, the second Sabbath of the new year. So I guess by now, if you've made New Year's resolution, you're either still doing them or you're not doing them. I was going to look up how long the average New Year's resolution lasted for, but I didn't get around to it. But it might play into the topic today a bit. We are going to be going through chapter 34, which is entitled The Invitation. And that's coming from The Desire of Ages, which is the middle book for Conflict of the Ages, which we've been going through online for Sabbath school. So it turns out it's extremely cold right now, and we're in Kirkland, just across the freeway from where the church is, and right now it's saying it's about 16 degrees. It is clear, however. So what's the temperature down in Boring?
17 and snowing and very windy.
Yeah, we don't have much wind and we don't have any snow, so that's good. Anyway, I was excited about this chapter because it has one of those verses in the Bible that you hear over and over again, and to the point where it almost becomes cliche. And then I got some new insights into it over the last year or so, actually, and I'll kind of share that in a minute. But I think what I want to do is have Jody read the verse, which is Matthew 11:28-30, and she'll be reading out of the New International Version, and then I'm going to read it out of the Message, and then we will start the discussion. And in the chat box are the three questions. One was labeled 1, and then 2 and 3 follow in separate bubbles. So I hope that's not confusing to people. So Jody, Matthew 11:28-30.
All right, 28. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light.
All right, and then to put this into context, which I should have done before Jody read, Jesus has just found out that John the Baptist has died. And actually, John the Baptist has not died. He's in prison, but he's sent his disciples to ask Jesus if he's the Messiah. And the disciples has just left. And Jesus talks about John the Baptist, and then talks about people not believing John the Baptist and not believing him. And then he prays to his Father, and he ends the prayer by stating this verse that Jody just read. And so, yeah, it's a verse any Christian has probably heard over and over as they grow up. But I like how Eugene Peterson in the Message Bible, which in a lot of ways, would it be a paraphrase? It's not a literal translation. His goal with his translation was to make it into modern day language. And so he says, are you tired, worn out, burned out on religion? Come to me, get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. So that's the verse that this chapter is about. So I guess when you read through that, I'll start with Jody, and then we'll move to Lee and Dad, I guess. You know, what comes to mind initially, and then we'll dive into it and answer some of these questions and tease it out a bit.
Yes, what comes initially is relief, kind of. Like if you come to me, like all your labor and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. That's the first part of it. And I think most people are like in this society and world we live in, like that sounds like a good thing.
Do you labor?
Some days more than others. Is that what you want me to say?
Well, I think we all do. Keep going.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And take my yoke upon you and learn from me. And I think that's important for us to learn God's ways. But I think we're slow learners because he's promising us that he'll give us rest if we learn from him and do this. And I think sometimes I don't know if we like to keep our own worries. I think we do. I don't think we're good at giving up and letting God reveal stuff to us. And then it says, and you will find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I think sometimes we just don't get that. We think that we're going to take everything upon ourselves, but I kind of like this week I thought about this verse, but then I kind of jumped to another verse, if any of you lacks wisdom, to asking God. And those two kind of go together in my mind. I guess to, ask God when we're stuck, but I guess the continual conversation with God is probably more important than just coming to God when we're stuck and when we're tired.
Okay, Lee.
Well, you're right. I think you're right, John. This is one of those verses that you've heard 100 times, and I guess it just kind of like hits the frontal lobe of my brain, and that's, oh yeah, I've heard that. And what actually kind of struck me a little bit is when you finally think about it, it's a yoke was to put two oxen together, so they're working as a team. And I always just kind of in my head, for some reason, this verse has always been, oh, rely 100% on Christ. Christ will take the burden. He'll do it all. But you're linking yourself to Christ, and that he's assisting you, so you're not out of the picture. You got to do work too, right? So you're putting two oxen together, and I don't know why this has just dawned on me now, but that's really what I mean, that's the main thing that I got out of this chapter was it kind of a new revelation on this verse that we've heard, like you said, hundreds and hundreds of times.
All right. We'll get back to that because that's kind of something that I came into understanding a little bit better as well. So, Dad, initial thoughts.
Well, it seems like it's really kind of going two different directions to me. I haven't had much experience with oxen or yokes, but what I think of is a tool belt. I don't know whether that's a good analogy or not, but you could say the same thing, I guess, against a yoke, and that is that I don't think of putting on a yoke or putting on a tool belt or getting set up to work as being getting ready to rest and have peace and that things will be easy. And it seems like to me so that this is suggesting actually conflicting things in a way. I think of taking off the yoke and taking off the tool belt or kind of, reducing things as being, in preparation for rest and peace and quiet.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Wow, I didn't expect this to happen. So earlier this week, I just, sometimes when you're looking up one thing, you see something else and then you read about it. And then I think God does work in mysterious ways because I ran across this earlier this week. I don't remember what day, but it was kind of a side reference to some of the stuff I was looking up. And It's titled "Taking Up Your Cross Is Not What You Think." And it's a commentary on that verse. And what he is saying, he's basically arguing that Jesus isn't necessarily wanting you to do what he did and die, die for the sins of the world, so to speak, or die for your sins or whatever. But taking up the cross was more of a statement to a commitment to this is what you're going to do. And once you take up the cross, there is, the idea is there is nothing that should stop you from finishing what you've decided to do, which is interesting because I've always been a little bit conflicted by that verse as well. But, and so that actually played into, my thoughts when I read about this. And the question I had kind of, I've struggled with the same thing Jody talks about. It's like, why are we so independent? And why is this such a hard thing to do? Because when you think about it, it should be something that makes your life easier, taking up your yoke. And that's what, when Dad, you said two different directions, I mean, that's kind of just the opposite of what the yoke is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to kind of have you going in one direction and keep you going in one direction. But I think when I've thought about this, I think that's the problem we have, is we are using an analogy that no one in America, at least, has any context for.
Yeah, but keeping going in one direction or keeping going in the same direction?
So
Yes.
tease that a bit.
Yes.
Well, both.
Yeah, I think both, but I think it's like, it's like, so I remember like in, grade school on field day, we do this like 3-legged race. And I kind of think that isn't the only thing I can think of that, like, I need to be working together with somebody else to be going in the same direction. I don't know. I just thought of that. And I always had the same partner, and we won every year because we had a system where we would count. And we're good team work because we would count 1, and that was the foot you were together, and 2 was your outer foot. And we would count, and like we figured it out. But
Nailed that one.
yeah, blue ribbon, that.
Blue ribbon, 3-legged racer in grade school.
But
Well,
that's
the
the only thing I can think of that is like, you're connected. I mean, there's always teamwork, but as far as being yoked with somebody.
So, by the way, I don't have a good answer to a modern equivalent, and that's as good as any. I mean, Lee, do you have an idea? I mean, Dad mentioned tool belt, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but
I mean, the only thing that I thought of was, and kind of what Jody was already talking about, is sort of the modern, the work group or partnering with somebody, small groups, working with someone. I mean, I guess the example in my own personal life is I'm dealing with this case, and I don't do litigation anymore. And all of a sudden I'm in court and freaked out and talk about a burden on my life. But being able to talk with my partner and being able to work with her and say, hey, have you done this? And she can, like, oh yeah, here's a motion that I did on a case, 5 years ago. Working together, that sort of, committee working experience, my burden doesn't go away, but it is way lighter. I'm getting that assistance that I need. And that's, and I thought of that went, back to my point of, this isn't just dumping it all on Christ. We have to be part of it too. But that's the only thing I could think of, sort of the modern equivalent is, these work groups that you are involved in, small committees.
Yeah, and that is something I've experienced. I mean, I've had partners in a previous life in Salt Lake, and I've had partners here in Seattle. And in both places, I've had partners that are easy to work with, very collegial. I said that wrong.
Yeah,
Collegial, very collegial. And it's not like we're best friends and doing everything together, but there's someone, if they're right there, you can ask them a question, or you can call them or text them. and they'll respond, and you value their opinion. And part of it is just because you feel like you're all kind of heading the same direction and doing all, trying to accomplish the same goals. Whereas I've had partners where you just almost don't want to be in the same room with them because everything you do ends up in some kind of a conflict one way or another. And a lot of the times the conflict is more personal than it is professional. You just don't see things the same. And so you're always kind of, I guess, to use another farm analogy, butting heads, so to speak. So yeah, I think I see what you're saying, Lee. And then Dad, you mentioned the tool belt. You want to tease that out a bit, or do you have a better one?
Well,
It's not bad.
I will say that my life, I really have never had a partner. I guess I had almost a partner for a couple of years when I was practicing. But even when I was a student or in high school, when I did electrical work for many years, I did it entirely by myself. I wasn't working with somebody at all. But I can get the idea that being with Christ will make it easier, because when I think of what the Pharisees had to put up with and had to do, the list of laws and just knowing the laws and okay, you can only do this until there, and all this, and as I was reading here, it says towards the back of the book, the chapter, it says, as through Jesus we enter into rest, heaven begins here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking, well, that's good, but it says heaven begins. Okay, that means that heaven is not something that hits us all at once. It's something that comes on. And so that possibly this peace, well, it goes on to say, we respond to his invitation, come learn of me, and thus coming we begin the life eternal.
Right.
That sounds like something that's evolving, that we can begin right now. Heaven is a ceaseless approaching of God through Christ. The longer we are in heaven of bliss, the more and still more glory will open to us, and that peace may become more real to us, or we may sense it more.
So that's interesting because that jumped out at me. Partly because I think there's a little bit of a disconnect in the world, in that we live here in the world, and Christians certainly believe that the world eventually gets destroyed, so the sin gets destroyed. But then I think the part that people assume at that point is that then you go to heaven, and heaven is somewhere else and not part of this world. And more, I do believe that once this world's destroyed, then there is a recreation that establishes the world the way it was meant to be before sin, and that we do once again live here on this world. So that's one point. The other point is interesting because this is coming out of the context of John the Baptist and his ministry, him ending up in prison, and Jesus in the middle of his ministry, and John's disciples talking to Jesus about, are you the Messiah? Are you the one that was meant to come and, save Israel, so to speak? And even John didn't have a clear picture of that, but both John and Jesus had an element to their ministry. The kingdom of heaven is here. And it was in relation to Jesus being here on earth. And I think that is very true, and that in a lot of ways, earth as we know it now is a proving ground for what earth will be once there is a new earth, and no sin. So that's the part of that paragraph, which is the last paragraph on page 331, if you want to look. But then I also thought the one I highlighted was kind of a definition of heaven in some ways, is that third sentence. I think you mentioned it. Heaven is a ceaseless approaching to God through Christ. And so, yeah, it's a process that starts now and goes into eternity. Anyway.
Yeah, it just that paragraph really spoke to me. It says, all that human nature can bear, we may receive here.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is one of those sentences that you say, man, does she really mean that? I mean, doesn't that strike you as a pretty bold statement? All that human nature can bear, that's everything we can bear, we may receive here.
So is that in a good context or in a bad context? Because that's, I think we always assume the bad, i.e., like Jody was saying, our labors are bad, and so we can make them better by being yoked to God. You know, all that humans can bear are bad, and so we want to be yoked to God. Do we forget about the good? Is the good, being yoked to God, as important as the bad? And is the problem good and bad, or is the problem that is the conflict that develops when neither one of them sync quite right?
I guess I'm not sure which direction you're wanting to go, but anyway, I was thinking, what analogy could I draw? And that is, this summer, I spent I don't know, a week or 10 days on a boat with my grandchildren. This was something that Jamie set up for me, and I don't remember. It was like 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I don't know. It was a bunch of different kids at various times, and I will have to say that was about as much fun as a person could really have. You know, there was not a bunch of fighting. Nobody was arguing about any particular theological issue or moral issue or anything else. Just enjoying life together, doing artwork, swimming, playing games, just doing things. And I will have to admit that was just one of the most enjoyable things I've done. You know, I mean, it was just, the boat continued to float the whole time we were there, and the water worked all the time. I mean, all of the usual things that I worry about and fight with, it went well. We had plenty of food. Lee made lasagna, I think it was. And we had enough lasagna there to last a whole month, I think. But anyway, we had plenty of food, and it was just a really enjoyable experience for me. And I'm wondering whether that's what it is, because this sounds like, the way this is written, that this is something that is evolving, that it's better later than it is at the beginning. Do you get that sense when you read that?
Well, yeah, certainly. And, you know, obviously it falls into the context of a parable to some degree. And you know that the people in Jesus's time, you know, basically could almost look over their shoulder and see this every day. And it's a dynamic thing, being yoked to someone. It's not, you didn't yoke the oxen when they were in the stall, you know, eating and sleeping, kind of a thing, which maybe is where the parable breaks down a bit. And maybe that's where we do get into trouble, when things are easy in our life. Maybe we become less yoked and more vulnerable to going the wrong direction, you know, which came up. You know, is it, you know, how important is it to be, you know, going the right direction versus the wrong direction, versus having a destination and ending up at that destination with different directions, I guess. I was going to say something and I totally forgot. So we will just keep moving ahead. So I don't want to derail this. Well, so what makes a yoke hard? That's the second question. We've kind of talked about modern equivalence. I don't think anyone has anything better than what we've come up with. And again, this is, again, where a parable in modern times may not work out as well as it did back in Jesus's time, but there is a good chunk of the world that still uses oxen and still ends up yoking oxen together. I just think in first world countries, you aren't going to see that as much.
Yeah, but I think it depends on if you're like, I don't know. Okay, so if a yoke is hard, what is, a modern day yoke? What are you yoked to, connected to all the time?
Okay. So what do you feel yoked to? I mean, I think most of us could say we feel yoked to our jobs.
Yes, or
And
I would
sometimes it's
say,
hard and sometimes it's not.
I would say most of society is yoked to technology for sure. Like they would panic if, the internet went out for, 2 minutes or whatever. So I think it's like stuff that we're connected to all the time in a certain degree.
And that's not bad because there clearly are other yokes, because Jesus is saying, my yoke is better than other yokes.
It seems to me that the worst possible thing that you could have if you were yoked to somebody is have some idiot that's going a different direction or jumping up and down or jerking back and forth, rather than actually just going together. And in the paragraph before this, it talks about that when we acquiesce, when we agree with or try to work with Christ, that all you have to really do then is just push, and under those circumstances, and I've never worn a yoke, so I have no idea, but it seemed like to me that it's a pretty ungiving thing, so that if you are just both pushing together, that it would be a whole lot simpler thing than having somebody that's trying to go a different direction completely,
All right,
or
so
that would be constantly stopping and then going and jerking around.
So Dad's going kind of to the last part of that question, what makes a yoke easy when things are in sync? And it is interesting. I think you mentioned the one thing, the point of a yoke is to, there's not much to do once you're yoked up with someone except to move forward. And so anytime you aren't moving forward, you're making it hard for yourself and for whoever or whatever you're yoked to in a lot of ways.
Yeah, so I mean, using the analogy that I did about working together as a group, what makes it hard is you got to rely on somebody or somebody else. You have to give up enough to realize that this other person that I'm yoked to, I chose to yoke myself to this person because they can do something positive, and I have to rely on that. And so it's hard giving up that sort of, control.
And then I would say the other thing with being yoked to someone or something is that you are able to do something more than you could do on your own. And you certainly, I haven't seen it in real life. Usually when I've been in third world countries and I've seen oxen, they either aren't yoked to anything, there's just one of them. Sometimes there's two of them, but, in pictures that you see displaying, oxen being yoked, you can see, any, 2, 4, 6, and obviously the more you have, the more you're able to get done, potentially, at least in the context of farming and using a yoke, to farm. Which again, I think it is hard in America to really wrap your mind around it. I think what makes yokes so hard is sometimes the conflict they generate.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Dad mentioned, in a lot of ways, at least Ellen White in this chapter mentions that the Pharisees were so yoked to the law as they saw it and following that law and not sinning, that they had made their religion so hard that no one could do it except for them, basically. And I think in America, at least, it is very similar to some organizations. There's just so much bureaucracy. You can certainly bring up politics in America as just so hard to get anything accomplished because, people aren't going in the same direction. And there's just a lot of conflict between, probably a smaller amount of issues than a larger amount of issues. And I think that can happen even personally. I don't want to make it so big that it doesn't apply to us, but even personally, I mean, you hear people getting married and people make the comment, oh, they're getting hitched. Well, it's very similar. And you certainly see relationships where there's a lot of conflict, and you see some relationships where there's not much conflict. And so this reminded me of a verse in the Bible, and I don't want to totally derail stuff, but I think this will kind of lead into the last question. What is the will of God? And Jesus, it has another parable. It's called the parable of two sons, and it's in Matthew 21. And I think Jesus at this point is in the temple courts, and he's kind of, as always, debating. And actually, the scenario right before this is when the authority of Jesus is questioned by the authorities of the temple authorities. And Jesus says, "What do you think? There was a man who had two sons. He went to the first and said, 'Son, go and work today in the vineyard.' 'I will not,' he answered. But later he changed his mind and went. Then the father went to the other son and said the same thing. And he answered, 'I will, sir,' but he did not go. Which of the two did what his father wanted?" And so the authorities answered, the first, they answered. And Jesus said to them, "I tell you the truth, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you," i.e. the authorities. And then back to John, interestingly enough, "For John came to you to show you the way of righteousness, and you did not believe him, but the tax collectors and the prostitutes did. And even after you saw this, you did not repent and believe him." So when I was thinking about this parable, Jesus mentions two groups of people, but there really are four. And the visual part of me graphed it out. And so you have a person that says, "Yes, I will do this," and then does it. And when that's the case, there's not much conflict. And that's one group of people that Jesus doesn't mention. The other group of people that Jesus doesn't mention is the person that says, "No, I will not do that," and they don't do it. So there's really no conflict there either. And I think you can use this to some degree, and like any analogy, it only goes so far, to look at Christianity, say, but I think it does apply to this yoke business, because the conflict comes when you got the guy that says, "Yes, I will do this." This is the third person. "Yes, I will do this," and they don't do it. And then the last group, the last one that Jesus mentioned is, "No, I won't do this," and then they change their mind and actually do that. And so those are the two groups that have conflict compared to the two groups that don't have conflict. And so when I was thinking about, for some reason, this came to mind after reading this chapter, and it led me to kind of the will of God. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at. You can fight the will of God, and there'll be a lot of conflict. And maybe the destination, you will be able to eventually get to that destination, but it won't be the easy way. And I think that's what, in a lot of ways, the Pharisees were doing, maybe, because it didn't need to be as hard as what they made it. And then the other part of it is, or you can just have that relationship with me and follow me along, and I will show you how things are done. And as a result, things could be a lot easier for you in reaching that destination. So talk to me. These are all my own thoughts, and they aren't necessarily right. But where am I right? Where am I wrong? How does this work with this verse of being yoked?
I like that verse. I like that story because I like to group myself with the tax collectors and prostitutes, in the sense that the Pharisees were so clear that, oh, well, I'm obviously doing the right thing, and I've read everything and I know what I'm doing, but then they clearly weren't doing the right thing. Whereas I like to think of myself in the other camp is I want to end up on the finish line in the right spot. And I know that getting there isn't a straight line, at least for me. And maybe I'm not a tax collector or a prostitute, but I mean, I got my failings in different areas, and that I like that because that does make my burden lighter to think that, yeah, I'm completely flawed. But if I keep trying every morning, trying to get up and being in that yoke, I can get to where I need to go. And I think you're right. It doesn't have to be, I mean, politics and all, it doesn't have to be big. I mean, you and Jody and me and Becky, it's like every morning you're making that choice, right? I mean, there's some times you're like, man, I'm going to throw this yoke off because it's driving me crazy. And other times you're like, yeah, no, you know what? You stay that course. So, I mean, I think it is very personal. So I like that you brought that verse up.
Dad, any thoughts?
Well, yes, I can't help but think of a relative of mine who I was with a lot, who had the goals of caring for others and doing the right thing, but what he did, in fact, was got two women pregnant that were not his wife. And let me just tell you that life became very hard for him in a whole lot of ways. And I don't even need to go into a lot of details, except for some of the husbands became offended by that. And I mean, just a wide variety of things. And so I would say that in that sense, that if he would have stuck with what he was supposed to do, just like you said in the original analogy of caring for and being or doing the right thing, life would have been for him immensely easier, even now. And I can think of that in a number of different analogies. I mean, we can see that in the political situation. You do several wrong things, and life can become really sticky. It can really get to be a hardship. And I mean, we see that in some people who life gets to the place where they just commit suicide, that they just don't want to go on. And I don't know whether that's the direction you're talking about, but it seems like to me in that sense that growing more like Christ, trying to go in the same direction he is going and he recommends to us, that life will just become immensely much more easy.
Yeah. And so so I guess the next question is how to go about doing that. Now, I think we need to recognize that in a world of sin, there's always going to be conflict. And I think being yoked to Christ in the best way possible does not free us from that conflict. But I do think that it may make it easier to overcome the conflict. And if nothing else, just emotionally and mentally, having that connection gives you a strength that, like we said before, that you wouldn't have on your own, because Christ is God and is all powerful and is able to get you through things you wouldn't be able to get through on your own. I liked the way Ellen White broke this down. And again, it's a very short chapter on basically literally 2-3 verses in the Bible. I think it's important, and it was important enough to her that she made it a chapter of its own. But when you look at the chapter, the way she broke it down was basically she took 3 parts of that verse and then kind of broke it apart. The first one is "Come unto me," and that kind of starts on page 329. And
28.
I was
Oh.
329, she kind of breaks down, come unto me. And that's kind of in one paragraph, and then goes straight into take my yoke. And then on the next page, 330, is where she starts talking about learn of me. And I mean, when you look at this verse, there's a lot to unpack in the verse. And I think sometimes let me look at this. Sometimes we see the yoke and we see the burdens that we have, and we want those burdens to be light, but there's a little bit more to it than just that. So obviously I think human nature has us jump on board with come to me if you're weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. I think that's by the end of the week. I mean, Fridays, I'm ready for that. And I thank God for Sabbath and all that entails. But when the second part that she mentions is take my yoke. And so obviously that goes hand in hand with what I just mentioned, but that the end of that sentence, or at the end of that section, is take my yoke and learn from me. And I think the learning is something, maybe if we wanted an action item for this, is something maybe we could all do a little better at. And then why? Because I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. How do we learn? How do we learn from Christ?
I think through experiences. I mean, I think at the beginning I said we're such slow learners because we do something and then we make the same mistakes twice and many more times, and we just don't get it. Like we get ourselves in a situation where like, hey, if I would have done this, it would have turned out a lot better. And so I think that like through our own life experiences, that God shows us like, hey, if you would have done it this way, and then we goof up again, and then remember when things turned out a little better. I don't know, but we are, maybe I'm just talking about myself, but I'm a pretty slow learner, at least. I don't always get it.
You aren't that slow of a learner.
When it comes to like God's will and things like that, like,
Well,
yeah,
Ellen White in this
you
chapter, when she talks about that, the learn of me part, it seems she goes on, talks a little bit about self-love being the problem and Christ's meekness is the thing that we need to learn. So I mean, I think Jody's just spot on. It's giving up of self enough to learn these lessons, and that's what I need to learn more from Christ, is that he relied on his Father for everything. And I struggle with that. How do I work that in my life? If I was retired and spent my day sitting in a chair reading the Bible by the fire, drinking a cup of coffee, that's one thing. But I also got to, work, and I got to deal with the car not working, and then parents' problems that I got to drive into town to deal with. So I'm like, I'm split. I do deal with the things of this world all the time. And so when I hear, that's what I struggled with the chapter before this. It seems so black and white. Every single moment you are in Christ or you are with Satan. And that to me is such a frightening idea.
So the sentence on page, 330. So she talks about learn of me, and then she says redemption is the process of which the soul is trained for heaven. And so that to me says, like, when you're training something, you're doing something over and over again. So maybe we're not slow learners, maybe we're training, because we're practicing, maybe. And I don't know if we'll ever get it, but we're training. Maybe we'll do better the next practice or something.
So,
But
go ahead, Dad.
yeah, but it it seems to me, I think that Lee is spot on this, and that is that, Jody, the position you're in the school is you're supposed to be telling people how to do it right. And with Lee, when you're the litigator up in front, you're the guy that is supposed to be coming up with the big ideas and doing things. But what it says here is that it says, learn of me, Jesus says, for I am meek. Jody, see, meek and lowly of and humble and quiet and withdrawing are not things that fit well with an administrator or with a litigator. And yet that's and Christ is saying that's the way I am. And frankly, I don't think of Christ being that way most of the time. My fear is the idea that he's going to make me burn in hell at the end. And I don't honestly think about that often, but I mean, that seemed like exact opposite of what he's saying he's like,
So that segued perfectly into what I was going to say. And that's the biggest conflict I have is, you're talking about Jody as a teacher telling people, teaching people things and how to do things right. And Lee as an attorney advising people on how to navigate the legal system the right way. And then you could argue as a physician, seeing a problem and fixing a problem, whether it's medically or surgically. But, they say with surgery, there are old surgeons and there are bold surgeons, but there are never old and bold surgeons. And the stuff I do in surgery sometimes honestly scares the hell out of me, because there's so much of it depends on the person actually getting better. And then if they don't, it doesn't fall on the person, it falls on the surgeon. And for whatever reason, it's just human nature. And so, I mean, we do all these things to make it better. And one of them is the old checklist, they've used aviation, and we live in Seattle and there's Boeing, and we just recently had that plug come out of the plane or whatever. And so we use aviation, we use the checklist system to make sure we don't miss anything. But the reality is stuff still gets missed at times. And then we live in a culture that's basically, what is it? Name, blame, and shame. And part of me says Jesus didn't have to deal with that. But part of me also realizes Jesus was under a microscope and constantly being battered. And so that's the conflict. Am I really living the life Jesus would want me to live? And the answer is, I don't know, and I'm not sure. But then if I'm that unsure about it, then why am I still doing it? And that's a whole nother issue. And so that's where I feel stuck, and that's where I have the biggest conflict in my life. And it's disturbing to me because it's a life that is not easily yoked to Christ. And so maybe it's not the kind of life I should be living. And then what kind of changes do you make so that you are living that life?
John, I feel the exact same way. But the one and only little thread that keeps me, I don't know, tethered is that I'm like, I struggle with the exact same thing, but I know I have enough awareness that I do analyze that. I do analyze, where am I going? What am I doing? Am I with Christ? And to me, even though I'm absolutely flawed and sinful of nature, the fact that I keep continuing to come back to that, it really is the only thing that gives me hope, because I'm trying to do these things that Christ is saying, and I might be failing at it, but I think the problem is if I just never try it anymore. I think that's I think the apathy there is the biggest fear. So, I mean, I don't know to answer the question. I can't answer the question is how do we incorporate God's will? I mean, I just don't know, like, what is that for me? But I do know that as long as I'm coming back to that question and I'm trying, that at least gives me some hope.
I like the idea that that's a thread of hope for you, because it's a thread of hope for me, because it means the Spirit is still working on me and leading and guiding. And so, part of me says, well, I should just stop doing what I'm doing and find something else. But then part of me says, well, no, God needs people doing what I'm doing just as much as non-godly people doing what I'm doing. But there's still that conflict, and it really weighs heavy on me sometimes.
But it seems to me, though, I mean, in both of you guys' cases, you are succeeding. You are succeeding more now than you were before, but that also means you're failing, but less. You learn to do it better, and it seems like to me that that's the situation that it's talking about here. Is that this is a constant progression. And even in heaven, it appears to me from the way this sentence is written here, that there will be a progression. There will be an improvement. There will be learning. That there will be, at the end of a period of time, there will be improvement in some sense. Otherwise, the way this sentence is written in here doesn't make sense. And I think that looking back, over my life, that I can say that the people that really helped were the people that got into the ring with me to help me. That's probably the wrong analogy, but anyway, these are the people that are willing to say, okay, let me see what we can do together. And the reason that we're facing so much pushback is not because of Christ and not because of what we're doing. It's because we have a whole host of people that have dedicated their life to criticizing, condemning, berating, trying to make you feel useless and harmful and bad. And we have to contend with that. That's not going to be something that we can get away from here. But there will be a time when that won't be. And the longer that you are at it, doing the right thing, the less that will attach to you. A rolling stone, I guess, gathers no moss is kind of the analogy you might say. Someone that's doing the right thing, doing it fast enough and honest enough and continuously enough, is not developing a whole lot of garbage on them.
I like, John, I kind of thought of that too, because I can't remember what verse, I was trying to find it again, but when he's talking about, you think you're the greatest, but you're considered the least in the kingdom of heaven. And I think that's the biblical evidence that we're talking about, that what you're saying, John, is correct. That and that, again, that's really hopeful to me, is like, wow, I can be in heaven and still be the least in the kingdom of heaven, but I'm in the kingdom of heaven. And that to me is like, that means I can keep going and I don't have to have it all figured out. And again, that's hopeful.
Well, and I think, and this should probably be wrapping things up. I think, and Jody mentioned, is it well, I forget what you said. Is it the destination that matters, or, i.e. the direction in the context of days, weeks, months, years, and decades? Is it where you end up that matters, or going in that same direction? And I think this isn't a text about whether you get into the kingdom of heaven or not, so much as how you go about doing it. And if you do it the more you can do it linked to Christ, the better that process of developing that relationship and living that life and being an influence on the other lives that you come in contact with can be, as opposed to, more like the Pharisees, where you're just trying to do the right things. It's that independence that you're talking about, Jody, that, we're so prone as humans to seek that independence that at some point that creates more conflict than less conflict, and you're better off having that relationship, and in that relationship learning from Christ and having that love of Christ that makes you want to continue to do things the way he teaches you to do them. And that's where I really like this verse, the way Eugene Peterson had it. Are you tired? Yes. Are you worn out? Yes. Are you burned out on religion? Yeah, in a lot of ways. Come to me and get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a rest, a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it and learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Keep company with me. So often I go to books to learn things, and the two books, kind of in the height of my frustration with some of the comments I made earlier last year, led me to this book, which is a bright orange book called The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, by a guy that actually lives in Portland area. And an interesting bright orange book that honestly has generated more conversations with more people just carrying it around into coffee shops and other places, and very much uses this text in a lot of ways to discuss some of the stuff we've talked about. The four main things he talks about is silence and solitude in Christ, the Sabbath, simplicity, and just slowing down and getting out of the rat race that this culture in America kind of leads us into. The interesting thing is he published the book and then gave a shout out to another book he came across that is eerily similar, and it's called An Unhurried Life. And this guy is a pastor, another pastor, but more of a traditional pastor. And this book is much more along the lines of pastoral care and church care, but covers a lot of the same things. He talks about extended personal communion with God. He has this thing called the 1/3 rule, which is about incorporating it into groups of people and then slowing down and getting sleep and stuff like that. So,
John, if I could just interrupt you for a second and say that book by Comer is just incredibly fine. I mean, that you gave me that book, and I want you to know I really appreciated it, because now I'm in a situation now where I can set my own pace, and I'll have to admit that it's a whole lot better, but it's not entirely that way because life affects me too. But I will say that what he points out about just slowing down and just enjoying it is just incredibly important.
Yeah, even in this in this world of sin, the life we live can have joy in it. And so in closing, I guess my prayer would be that we all have the strength and courage to come to Christ and to take his yoke, which are his ways, and incorporate them into our lives, and then embrace the opportunity to continue to learn from him. Make mistakes, try not to make them more than once, but to learn from them and to help others as we live this life that leads hopefully to a new life in a new world without sin. And so that's where I'll leave you. Eastside is still having church today. It will also be online. And so I appreciate this conversation, and I appreciate you joining me, Jody. and Lee and Dad and the things we were able to learn. I think the one thing I learned from this is that it's a process more than anything. And so it doesn't happen all at once. It's not something that's one and done. It's something you kind of do day in and day out, and there'll be good times and bad times with that process. So. All right, Jody, can you close with prayer?
Heavenly Father, thank you for your Sabbath and thank you for the day of rest that you have given us and that you that correlates with what we've talked about, giving us rest in our lives. And hopefully it's more than just one day a week that we take advantage of your rest. And be with us, be with those in the cold, and which is all of us, but fortunately we have warm homes and heat and lights and everything else. So be with us today and guide us. Thank you that we are free to worship you and that we have that opportunity today. So go with us and be with us in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, John.